everyone. About to get started here. So, good morning. I'm Patrick from Morsec Education. Excited to introduce Cam Iliff. He's got former vice president of software at Aries. He has over 25 years of experience working in K-12 schools to develop and implement next generation student information systems. He's played a key role in shaping student data systems in California, working with over 400 districts and serving as a leader in CSIS and CalPADS advisory groups for nearly 2 decades. With deep expertise in translating school district needs into innovative solutions, Cam is here to share some valuable insights on the future of student data systems with Apollo. Please join me in welcoming Cam Iliff.
All right. Welcome everyone. I know this isn't the most fancy, snazzy session here, and definitely up against some powerhouses left and right, but I'm really happy that you're here. We're going to get the opportunity here to talk about Apollo and what makes us different. And kind of move on to the next slide here. And by the way, we got Mike Gordon also here, Vice President of Sales for us. In this session, it was about, when we talk about trying to put together a session, like what is it, how do we fit within this ecosystem, this conversation around the future of education, and when you talk about SIS. And I kind of start with this quote that I found, and it just kind of came up. Oops, some slides love to advance on their own, but came across this quote. I didn't know who it was from at first, but I tracked it down. Great teachers in great schools make great students and citizens. And happened to come from probably the ex-governor of Virginia at one point back in 2013. And I think for me it spoke to what we're doing. And in the SIS space, so Apollo being a brand new student information system in the industry, how can we be different? And how do we avoid, I would say, the platitudes of student information systems in the past? You hear a lot of, or pretty much every SIS, whether it's PowerSchool or Synergy or Aries, they all talk about this idea of student data management being somehow, how does it impact student success? Some vendors, some SISs put it in their taglines for their software systems. And really I'll be honest, it's always a stretch. It's sure you have a data analytics system, sure you have an early warning system, sure you have your CCI indicators, you have your career planning software and tools. Those can have an impact. And I've had the opportunity to have some really great impacts on some students over the years. One of them being, I think, the one that hit me real hard was a parent who came to us thanking us. It was just after we were, when I was at Aries, we were the first SIS to release preferred name and gender as a fundamental part of the software for students. And so when the substitute teacher came in for a transgender student, they weren't outed with their dead name. And this had not happened before in SIS. I forget what year it was, but for that family, made a huge impact. And so you can certainly have some very, very distinct impacts when you talk about specific features. But let's say, be honest, it's still a stretch, right? I think Parsec is going to have a much better or a greater impact for a possibility of student success and school success than any SIS out there. So the question is, what can we do as an SIS to actually achieve success? And this talks to me, because this question of what makes a great school. What makes a great school to create and nurture great teachers, to create and nurture great students that create great citizens down the road. Well, I was inspired this morning, I changed up my slide deck. The 5 dysfunctions of a team. So how does your student information system fit into your team? Is it a member of your team? Is it a functional and fundamental member of your team? Or is it the dysfunctional member of your team? And starting at the bottom, and I have some pointed questions, and I'd like to say that Apollo and our vision supports this idea of Apollo as part of your team. You trust. So what level of trust do you have in your current SIS? Is it stable? Do bugs come out all the time? Does data disappear? Are the reports accurate and effective? And is your SIS actually adapting to your changing needs over the years? Can you trust them in that way? And at the conflict level, I hear this all the time talking with districts. They're afraid to bring up issues with their SISs. Or the SIS, when they bring up issues like, hey, this has a bug, or this has, we need this particular feature, the SIS fights back, right? They're not embracing the conversation. They're not looking at that feedback and taking it to make their system better. And maybe at one point they were like that. I think we all kind of maybe go through that, and maybe they change over time, and that's where your SIS is sitting today. There was actually an interesting scenario here in terms of fear of conflict. In a couple of weeks, we have the opportunity to do a head-to-head featured demo against the other major players of SIS in California. And this is for the Orange County site group. And a couple of us included, so we were invited, and we're like, yeah, let's do it, let's get in front, let's have a conversation, let's be honest about where we're at and compare against the other players in the market. Fabulous. One of the other major players, they said, sure, yeah, we'll be there. But the third player, who happens to be fairly big in California, was very, very apprehensive. They didn't want to show up. And I'm getting this feedback from the organizer saying, hey, it might only be two of you. Because I'm having this conversation with the third, and they're scared. They don't want to present. They're asking me for a list of questions that they might get. So why are they scared? And it's that fear of conflict, because they feel like their current state of business is in conflict with their customers. Now, obviously, I would hate that ever to occur with us, and we're there. we're there as part of it. Commitment. Are you confident that your SIS is actually committed to you? Do they have a roadmap for features that they can commit to, that they can communicate with you? And can they be trusted to uphold that commitment? And is there accountability? And gosh, when I think about accountability, the first thing that comes to mind is, anyone read the book Extreme Ownership? Right? That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think about accountability. It's owning, in the software world, it's owning your bugs. It's owning the deficiencies. It's not blaming the customer for the customer maybe doing something wrong in the system, right? There was a button they shouldn't have pushed. There was data they put in that was maybe invalid, and that caused issues downstream. You open up a support ticket, and all of a sudden the support person's blaming you for the problem in the software. Well, accountability and taking on extreme ownership, to me, as somebody who is a product leader, says, what, my software wasn't good enough to avoid that issue. And I need to change my software so you can't put in that bad data, so that you can't push the button when you're not supposed to push the button, right? I want to make the software better. And then finally that attention to results and inattention to results. And that's going to boil down to, my notes is your software result oriented? And this one actually, this sung to me as well, because this inattention to results, and what you're going to see here on the next slide is that in Apollo, we actually specifically address this. What is the Apollo difference from a student information system standpoint? And sorry, I keep the slide advancing, but that difference. And my first bullet point, the first bullet point was already up here before I put the chart diagram up there, was we actually have outcome-oriented actions within the system. Meaning, when we look at the result of what the customer wants, what the user wants, the button that they push, the action menu that they click, those are going to represent the final outcome that that user wants to achieve. And it's not about having an edit button and a view button and a bunch of fields all over the place, but that with Apollo, we support real world school operations. That as an SIS, you can have a view button, you can have an edit button, and you can have 15 fields on this particular record, on a student or an enrollment record. But what are you trying to achieve when you start to edit a record, or when you add a new enrollment record, or we get into a bunch of things that I'll demonstrate. In traditional SISs, they force the user to go through this generic process of editing a record and going and modifying the fields that they have to know, that they're trained to know, that the documentation says they should actually edit. But in Apollo, we give a button that gives the outcome they want, and we guide them to that destination, to that result. So, in the other bullet points, we get into, with the Apollo difference, that longitudinal user experience. So it's a big thing in SIS, it's a big thing in data management, traditional student information systems. They've been one school year at a time. And those SISs, it's because they're old. Because back in the days, back in the 80s, back in the 90s, we didn't have the databases that could support longitudinal databases, right? It wasn't, to get technically wonky, it wasn't until SQL 2000, maybe SQL 7, where you could really support larger school districts in a single database without going to something like Oracle. Before that, it was flat files and DOS and mainframe systems. They had to segment the data in such a way that it was manageable for them from a memory utilization standpoint, all this stuff. But those concepts still continue today. 30 years later, 30 years it's been since Windows 95, right? It's been a while. So why is the SIS you're using today still dependent upon data structures that originated in DOS, right? So we have a longitudinal database, of course. Any new student information system, any platform today, built today, should have some form of longitudinal database. But we go beyond that and we create a longitudinal user experience. And as you'll see when I log into Apollo, you're not asked for year, you're not asked for school. All the data is available in real time without having to switch your context. And this even applies to our parent portal, what we call our community portal, which we've actually built it out where a parent who has a student in multiple school districts, or so maybe an elementary district and a high school district, that one of the kids may be over at a private school or charter school. As long as they're all using Apollo, the parent logs in and actually has a comprehensive multi-school district experience, because the experience is about the person, not about what district they're logging into. So they see all their students from all of the schools that they're in, and can enroll students right from there, or apply for admission to any of the schools within the platform, all from the single place. And of course, no technical debt. We're brand new. 3.5 years ago is when we started, and I'll get into a little bit more background once I exit the slides here, but that no technical debt is so huge. I was at Aries for 24 years. I saw, when I came in, it was on Microsoft Access 2.0. Windows, started in Windows 3.1, we were fiddling around with Windows 95 and Windows 98. All of our schools that we implemented back in 98, 99, 2000, they barely had internet access. When I first started working at Aries, I was in the support department. I was debugging printer drivers. And it's the basic stuff. But we were teaching people how to use a mouse. We were teaching people Windows. And times have changed, obviously. You know, we have internet access today. That didn't exist necessarily in 1998. So we now have a platform that's designed for the technology of today, not a platform that was adapted to today's technology. So we can actually take full advantage of it. And again, that modern platform, we are in the cloud, we are SaaS, so it is a software as a service. When you fire up Apollo, Apollo's just there in the cloud. It's like every other educational tool you buy today. You don't install it locally on a server. They don't necessarily have to go through a big long implementation process. We push a couple of buttons and your system is activated behind, and off you go. We can do the implementation, data conversion, and such. So it's a modern platform. So that's going to take me out of the PowerPoint. So go ahead, cancel that out, and I'm going to do here, give me 1 second, and I'm going to switch up my sharing, my window share.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please, absolutely.
I'm a retired professor from Fresno State, but I have a social justice nonprofit, and I serve from preschool to doctoral programs at Fresno, or in education. Why do so many people go from administrators to teachers, and they leave out counselors in the discussion? Because counselors do so much of this work. When I was an elementary principal and middle school principal and a high school teacher and counselor, I'm just putting it out there because I still am very involved in education, and specifically as a social justice leader. I'm always curious as to why counselors aren't mentioned.
Probably the honest truth.
That's
When we talk about things,
yeah.
it could be union power. When you start
Pardon
talking
me?
about there, but when we talk about software, are we building software for counseling staff? What are their needs? What do they do on a day-to-day basis? I think there's some good tools out there that help counselors. SISs have certainly built a fair share of those. College and career readiness. We now have CCGI going statewide in California. All the SISs are required to integrate with CCGI. You had Naviance forever, but I mean, the issue behind Naviance and even CCGI is engagement. These platforms are really good for initial college career readiness planning, but they lack continued engagement between counselors and students and parents to keep the academic plans live and updated. And so you wind up getting into, obviously caseload problems with counseling staff. We know that there's not enough counselors in schools. So how do you let them manage larger caseloads? And I think that's a challenge for every software system that should be addressed with SISs, but it's not necessarily there. And SIS may ignore counselors because they don't make the SIS decisions. There are a few groups in California that make SIS decisions when you go district to district. Sometimes you have the superintendent who's very powerful, has a lot of influence, and they can use the stick that they have to move to a new SIS. Teachers, when you get to an RFP and a bid process and demonstrations, the biggest group in the room is normally teachers.
Yeah, but the counselors have a lot to say about what kinds of students use.
Mm-hmm.
I had 600 to 1. That's how crazy
Yeah.
it was many years ago. I just throw it out there as a possibility for someone answering the question. I've asked the question for over 30 years and I have yet to get a really good answer.
So with Apollo, kind of give you a little background in terms of how we've grown to where we are today. We, in our 3.5 years of product development, we now have 4 customers live, 2 charter schools and 2 school districts here in California using Apollo since this last summer. We reached the point where we're at, though, not necessarily because of those early adopters, but because we developed what we call trusted advisors. And it's a technique I've used over the years when I was at Aries, and when I came over to Apollo, did the same thing. And one of the first phone calls I made was to the lead counselor at a school district that I've known for many years, who also taught at University of Redlands, and brought her on as a trusted advisor. Now, sometimes we have the opportunity to get that advice from her, and other times we're building out teacher functionality, so we get teachers to advise us in those areas. But you have to have the right mix of people in the room. It can get, for an SIS, especially over the years, you get narrower and narrower the scope of people you converse with. I'd say the more mature your software becomes, because you're engaging with the student data coordinator at the district office, and that's your point of contact. That's you're talking all the time. So it's hard to sometimes crack beyond that student data coordinator and communicate with teachers, to communicate with counselors, principals, on their day-to-day, and attendance clerks, on their day-to-day operations. And I remember back in 98, 99, 2000, I spent a lot of time at schools. Aries, we were young, growing at the time, but my programmers today, or my programmers where they were at Aries when I left, they don't go to schools anymore. In fact, SISs commonly don't go to schools anymore at all. They'll deal with the district office folks, and that's about it. And if the DO people can bring in school people, that's great, but they're not actively seeking them out. But just 2 weeks ago, I brought on 2 teachers on our trusted advisor group. And that's really a matter of, I'd say, the networking and the people that I've engaged with over the years to create that advisor network that it interacts at all levels. And maybe say I have an advantage coming from an education family. My mother was a teacher and a dean, principal. Now she's a retired school board, and now on the school board. And then got school board president. She's so happy. And she won unopposed this last time. So
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take you off.
No, you talk about the culture, and Apollo is that same culture. And like, I feel like I'm an extension of that. And I'm sitting up here, and for forever I was the face of Aries, and now I'm the face of Apollo, and I want to apply that same culture here. Now I look towards our CEO, Brad Blankenship, as the ultimate guide to the company, though. He is the product owner. He comes from a very long education background, just like me. He goes back to, what was the first company he was worked for, was Mike?
Brad?
Yeah, Brad.
He worked for
Yeah, so he worked for SchoolMax back in the day. Some of you may know them. Was involved with the LA Unified implementation back in the day, and then worked at eTrition, and then founded Titan, the school nutrition system. Built that up. He's a programmer, and back a few years ago, he wanted to start building an SIS, and so applying that. I'd say my experience in SIS and his vision for how we roll these things out, and some of those items you saw on the slide deck, those come from Brad's vision for how we are going to build this piece of software. And I think the synergies have come out really well. So any other questions there? Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the software. So I'm logging in, and as an administrator, so not a parent. I don't have that demo for you guys. I gotta find my login here. There it is. Okay, and when I log in, I'm gonna see a district selection because I'm a sysadmin, so I have that choice. Now you guys, most folks won't have that, but there are some scenarios here with county offices of education and charter school networks and private school networks too, where a single organization is managing multiple other LEAs, right? Tons of COEs are helping manage the small school districts in their county, charter schools in their county. We can actually enable the COE folks to have access to all of their districts and just their districts with a single login, not a different login per district, but a single login that has access to multiple districts. And we also have the infrastructure to support a charter school network that maybe have charters through 5 or 6 different school districts. We know those exist. And so oftentimes they might, for structural reasons, they may need to be in different districts within the platform, but we can actually create a centralized management layer so that that charter school network administrator can actually handle multiple, in essence, school districts at once. So this multi-district coordination is a fundamental part of our infrastructure.
With the COEs, do they, I imagine they do some data sharing MOUs in the background to be able to manage that?
Well, so yeah, their relationship, a COE and say a charter school or a small school district, they absolutely have MOUs where the COE is acting on their behalf. Like Placer County, they actually have a consortium of districts that they've all bought Aries at the same time. And so the COE manages the implementations and does first level support for those organizations. And then they pass on support of anything they can't handle. So very common business model. Ventura County Office of Ed has that with their Equitas product. And they've done it for a long time. Riverside COE was doing it for a bunch of their districts. Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna log into Luna School District. And like I was mentioning, there is no question about what year you're logging into, what school are you logging into. This is very different than every other SIS on the market today. When I go to students, I see a comprehensive list of all of my students. It's whether I have access to 1 school, 2 schools, or all the schools in the district. The system is going to just customize the experience for me. So when I go to view all, not just the currently enrolled, I can see students who graduated or left the district in the past, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. They're all there. It's a longitudinal platform. I don't have to go to a special page. I don't have to switch to that particular year. And that's the experience that our competition has grandfathered in from the days of old. Now, and another design concept we've implemented is that everything is a person within Apollo. So if a student graduates, eventually you employ them, they become a staff member. That staff member, maybe down the road, then they have a child who enrolls in the district, and their neighbor, they're the emergency contact of the neighbor's kids. You have all these people that interact with the school district. We call them personas, but they are still an individual person. And in Apollo, we link them all together so that if the parent is the emergency contact who's also an employee, and you have a name change, that name is propagated throughout. If you have a phone number change, that phone number is propagated throughout, because we look at every individual as a person. And just like with that person of a parent logging in and accessing multiple school districts, we actually extend that personhood across multiple districts under some circumstances. Okay? So pretty powerful. There's been some conversations around down the road, what does it look like a high school district and an elementary school district? They're both running Apollo. How do we ensure that data flows effectively and efficiently? The traditional model for an SIS would be some sort of bulk export from the elementary district that gets loaded in a bulk import into the high school district, and they do that every year, and maybe they do some refreshes throughout the end of the school year. In Apollo, that's probably not going to be our solution. We haven't built that solution yet. But our solution is probably going to be more like, well, we're going to create a multi-district relationship right? Where the high school district and the elementary district become connected in a very specific way, in a data sharing agreement, where the elementary district can focus and can basically flag the students who are in their high grade level, who are going to be matriculating to the high school district, who have not communicated that they're going to a charter or a private or moving somewhere else. And that because of that flag, the high school district then has access to those records in real time. And it's because we have a single longitudinal database that's multi-tenant in the cloud. So each district doesn't have their own encapsulated data. It's not a data silo. We've broadened it to be a community data, but of course secured and restricted down. You have a similar solution with products like SACE and CYRUS for IEP management. When a student moves between one district and another district in the SACE platform from the San Joaquin COE, that student's IEP comes along with them. Why can't we do that with an SIS? And not do it where you're actually functionally moving data, but you just have access to that data. And maybe you can't edit the previous records, but you should have access to those previous records. So we can create those controlled, secure data sharing agreements as we move forward.
So a kid could, I'm sorry, so
No.
a transcript could, at one high school, they move to a high school out of district, if they're using Apollo, that transcript could just
That transcript should flow, yeah.
No manual entry.
In the end,
Registrar.
there would have to be, so there will always have, I wouldn't say there would be no manual entry, but in that case, there is some mapping that has to go on, because in that case, the data for the transcript does need to physically move. Like we don't want to be CalPADS, right? We don't want to be the state longitudinal data system necessarily. So we need to support the data being translated on a transcript in the new, and we have that built out in the system, and so you have to figure out how they map over. But it would help if they do, because we actually provide more information electronically than we can actually communicate on a single piece of paper. And so I think every SIS has tried to kind of achieve that type of scenario, and even CSIS with their the California transcript thing that they were trying to do many years ago that failed. We've even had conversations with the community college, and that fell through. Financing fell through in order to make that happen. One of the big problems is the diversity of data. We want to try to create a unified experience across the board for all districts, across all SISs, but the problem is the current data standards date back to the 1980s in the Speedy Express data standard, and that's a tough one. Nobody's come up with a better data exchange structure, and maybe one ed tech can come to the table, but I even think their standard's still based on the old Speedy Express. But yeah, we can do it. We can do better, but so we have that unified platform. We have that unified person experience, that multi-year experience. And what I'll do here is kind of, before I get in, I talked about how do you make your schools run better, right? So let's come back to it. This isn't necessarily about individual features inside Apollo, but the structure of Apollo is designed so that when you have staff turnover, it's easy for that new staff member that you hire to learn Apollo and do their job. The training required for Apollo, we are finding, is about 20% of the training required for traditional SISs, or what we call them legacy student information systems. So the legacy SISs are very dependent upon a high level of training, a high level of documentation. Our goal is zero training, zero documentation, pure intuition. What's the last application you put on your phone that required training or reading documentation for, right? It's the last website you signed up for that you had to read documentation. Doesn't exist out there. In the real world of software, outside of this little bubble of that we call SIS in schools, You don't require training. So why can't we do that? Why can't the legacy SISs do that? They can't do it because their philosophies are dated. We can do it because our philosophies are new. So this idea that this search, this is a very natural search. I go to students, there's a search. If I go to households, I get the same experience, there's a search. I go to staff and there's a search. Things are in the same place. They look the same. They act the same. Things are very natural. If I want to view a particular teacher, I just click that row and I see that data. I'm going to go over to students, but it's this idea that everything is natural and easy to do. And when I talked about outcome-oriented actions in the platform, what I mean by outcome-oriented, and we see this example here of a student, if I want to no-show a student, now no-show, for those that don't know that particular process, is when a student was pre-enrolled to show up and they didn't show up. In legacy SISs, you are required to train at least one person every school site how to no-show a student. And inevitably they mess up, and many school districts have eliminated that capability altogether from the school sites because they couldn't get it right. So they forced it to be a district function. Like, that's horrible. That shouldn't be just a district function. Now you're offloading something that really should just be a push of a button. And in Apollo, it is a push of a button, because you go into our action menu. It's very natural. Got a couple ellipses over there. Everyone knows that button. And we click the action that says no show. So the system comes up and it's going to have some business logic. It knows that no-show situations, no-show processes, they differ according to different situations. This kid was enrolled last year. They rolled over from last year. So their no-show process involves modifying last year's enrollment record and deleting the current year enrollment record. And getting rid of the attendance and getting rid of the class schedules from this year because they never showed up, and we need to report this to CalPADS properly. And then CalPADS has certain rules around which codes can be used under what circumstances. Well, those are implemented by our system for you. They're in our configuration and setup. So in this particular situation, I get these exit reasons that include transfer to another school in the US, and these are all the standard CalPADS values. But when you have a student, show my example student of Able, who actually, that one's not me. I think somebody messed with my sample student because this isn't gonna come out right. Oh, after school, okay. So with Able, and I go into no-show them, notice it is their brand new enrollment. And when I no-show them, I'm given a no-show condition, and I'm only given the state code, which is N470 in the CalPADS code set, for a pre-enrolled no-show. That's their only option, because we know this is a brand new student to the district. So that applies throughout. And I'll give you another example. Attendance and truancy. There's a concept called late. And late is an unexcused absence that's more than 30 minutes for that period or that day. And it has to be for an unexcused reason. It has to be more than 30 minutes. So that's considered a day of truancy in the truancy laws. But if it's 29 minutes and we don't care the reason, it's considered a tardy. So every new attendance person that you hire, you have to train them on this rule. It's in your documentation. It's in your process and procedure documents. In Apollo, that's not the case. In Apollo, you just say when they showed up, the time. We calculate 29 minutes versus 31. And you give the reason, whether it's a doctor, a dentist, ditched, went to Disneyland for the morning, or whatever the case may be. Those reasons, they're excused or unexcused. So in Apollo, your district policies are implemented by the software, not by the people. So let that sink in. You don't have to train your people to implement district policies. You encode the policy in the software, and the software enforces it for you. Reduced training, reduced documentation, reduced errors, and a greater adherence to policy. And we have lots of policy flexibility. With Apollo, we are going to be more than California. Our early adopters are California. Most of our sales work is here in California, but we have bigger vision. We've been talking a lot with Arizona school districts. They run similar software to California. They have ADA calculations, they have state reporting. They look a lot like California, but they're not happy with their current SISs either. They're in the same boat with legacy SISs. So we have some commitments out there, and we want to hit some other states. And it's these policy implementations, because we know that California has different policies than Arizona, statewide policies, not just district policies. You have policies in Texas, and gosh, you get into Texas, and every school district invents their own GPA calculation. And so as we build out GPA calculations, that's something that we have to be able to honor and allow for that flexibility to create these custom configurations. And our configuration area is quite extensive. It gets into attendance codes and policies, daily attendance roll-up rule sets. And this is, when you say no training, I mean training from an end user. We will spend the majority of our time in a new customer implementation, flowing through all of these configurations, aligning all of your district's policies to how they need to be implemented. And another one that I like to point out in terms of policy alignment comes in with civil rights data collection and CalPADS reporting for incidents. On incidents, you have this problem, there's this big problem with CRDC. CRDC is occurring right now, right? The submission is being submitted. Well, it's on data that is up to 18 months old, of which the students may not be there anymore, your employees might not be there anymore, who knows what type of documentation there is. So it is so critical that the rules and policies that CRDC applies to us be implemented in the software, so you don't run into this problem right now. And you get the same thing with CalPADS reporting. Discipline is submitted in end of year submission. So you're doing it in like June, July, August, and the folks that did the discipline put it in, maybe your principals or clerks, they're not even at school. I mean, they may be off for the summer. Meanwhile, your poor CalPADS data coordinator, they're going and trying to submit this data, and they're getting errors. So how do you stop those errors from happening up front? How do we apply policy within the system? So we do that. Here's an example. I'm going to go into a discipline record, which, by the way, on the discipline record, we have multiple types of discipline. We can have classroom discipline, classroom behavioral, we could have behavior emergencies, we could have 48900 violation discipline, various levels. And they have different offenses, they have different responses. So we don't let you suspend for certain offenses. Or offense types. We actually even use different language when we talk about discipline versus a behavioral emergency. They're both incidents, but discipline has an offender. Behavioral emergencies have an actor, right? Because students going through behavioral emergency, they're not necessarily doing it in terms of a 4900 offense. So we customize that. But let's take a look at discipline. And when we look at a participant, we got Roberto here, and I'm gonna go ahead and just edit his record. And by the way, our incident module supports folks involved in an incident that aren't even in the school district. So when you choose, you can actually choose, if I go back one step, if I add a participant, we can either search, and we can include discipline incidents or any sort of incident type that involves contacts, staff members, students, parents, or not in the district, and I put in that information. So I may have a witness who is just some random person at the football game, or I may have an incident, and we know with CRDC, it does request that staff incidents, certain incidents be reported. Now, Should that be in the SIS? Should it be in the HR system? Does your HR system have an incident tracking system? Probably not, right? So, but CRDC wants it, so you're rifling through paperwork, you're asking the HR, and who knows if the HR, your department is actually managing that properly. Apollo, we can actually track staff incidents and staff behavior. But, so that's one thing we can do. I'm gonna go kind of back out here on the original conversation of data quality and policy. And so we see this was an offender, Roberto. His offense was bullying. And in bullying, we have a participant motivation. And if we choose one that's religion, the participant perceived religion, which is a CRDC aggregation, is required. If I don't have religion, notice the perceived religion is gone and is also not required. I also have in an offense, notice down below here, whether the weapon was involved. And this is one of the biggest problems in CalPADS reporting, that I have an incident that involved a weapon, let's say brandishing a knife, and because that was so obvious, nobody actually put in weapon type
They miss it all.
knife. Miss it all the time. And so sometimes it's very vague, like, well, I don't know what offense, it's some random one, and you're reading through the description to try to figure out what weapon type it was. And well, in this case, because this offense is a known weapons offense, we now require at least one weapon type to be selected. We'll select knife. So this is how we enforce the policies, and sometimes those policies are imposed upon us from the outside, from state reporting, but in the end, a district policy that the school must honor. We cannot suspend for reasons that the district says we can or cannot suspend for, or have detention, assigned detention. The weapon type is managed, the motivation and religion is all managed. So come CRDC, your data clean. Come end of year CalPADS reporting, that data is clean. So lots of examples.
How about if we're police contacted? Is that on there? Because that's another one that they miss in the legacy systems, because they have to go to a completely different screen.
The police contact is on, I'm going to discard this change. That is on our response area. So when you have a response to the incident, so we record the offenses, and then we actually tie the response to a specific offense. So a student may have 2 or 3 offenses. You can actually tie the response to the actual offense. It's not a pool of offenses and a pool of responses. So you can actually, it's like align that policy a little bit better. This case, we have a response, and then the action authority. Down here, let's see, where did I put? I'm trying to find that one.
It's just I'm just curious because of my experience in doing CRDC reporting.
That one, I forget where I put that. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay.
But we do have the other CRDC fields like incident response policy, that zero tolerance response policy is in here for CRDC. Obviously receiving instructional support. If this was a special ed student, this would be required to have a response. Obviously it's not here, my student is not. And then removal has that. So, we keep going, and this philosophy is, we think it's a pretty big deal. Another philosophy that we implement is that all schools in Apollo are real. Okay? The list of schools you have in Apollo is real. If you look in your list of schools in Aries or Power School or these others, you're going to find summer school, some high school, summer school, some elementary school, summer school, some you're going to find inactives, some you're going to find a graduates school. You're going to get these fake schools. Sometimes you're going to have a independent study school that's not a real school, because maybe you don't have an alternate alt-ed program or an alt-ed school that actually has a CDS code, but you're still running an independent study program that's a multi-school independent study program, and so you rip these kids, you put them in this fake school, and you handle it all through there. Well, in Apollo, all of that is handled in a completely different way. Inactive students are just inactive. They don't need to be transferred into a specific school because it's a longitudinal database, so that need goes away. For summer school, we implement a concept called instructional settings, or instructional sessions. In instructional sessions, it means that we can look at this student enrolled at Margaret Hamilton High School for multiple years, and we have an enrollment details, which I'll get into here in a little bit. I don't want to get sidetracked. But notice in 2024, we have both the regular school year enrollment and the upcoming summer school enrollment. It's a session, instructional session of the year. After school is an instructional session, and next year, as the attendance recovery policies are being expanded upon for next year, a great element of Apollo is that Apollo is already a 7-day-a-week system. So Saturday school, you can have an instructional session called Saturday school, and it only runs on Saturdays. But really, you're probably going to have your after school / Saturday school all blended into a single session, and no matter when the student shows up, we'll be able to calculate those figures and apply the appropriate apportionment and attendance recovery back in. So we can link up these instructional sessions. The other that I like to point out is that a big difference in Apollo and every other SIS is how we handle independent study. So it's probably, I don't say the number one headache. It is a major headache for most schools. And with the changes to law last summer that enabled independent study to be administered for 1 day at a time, there was no longer a 3-day minimum. And there is, it gets a little wonky. So, this idea that if I have a student on contract, to have a long-term, open independent study contract, and they're sick on a Tuesday, I can put that kid on 1 day of independent study. It's a phenomenal way to keep your apportionment numbers up. And when that student is maybe sick for another couple of days, the majority of your schools, all the content is online. Coming out of COVID, all of our teachers learned, put it in Google Classroom, put it in Canvas. I know when my high schooler is sick, he's done with his regular school day and all of his homework by noon, because he's not that sick, right? He's sick enough where I'm not gonna send him to school and get everyone else sick, but he's gonna sit in his chair at his computer and he's gonna do his classwork. So he gets on Google Classroom and he finishes it up. And we know that instructional content is both there, it's readily available to be given to students. Why his school district doesn't put him on independent study, I don't know why. Because legally he can. But one of the reasons might be it's a headache. How do you make it easier to implement short-term independent study for these type of attendance recovery and increase apportionment, increase funding for your district, because we make it easier? Well, we do that is looking at independent study in a completely new way. All SISs currently on the market today treat independent study as attendance. 100% of them is attendance. And they do that because independent study is, I wouldn't say it's new, but it's relatively new, and it's also not universal countrywide. Arizona does not have independent study. Most other states do not have the concept of independent study. So SISs that have been built for other states back east or in the Midwest, they come to California, they go, what's this independent study thing? Oh, it counts for apportionment? Oh, it must be attendance. So they have a square peg, they have a round hole, and they make it fit, okay? But with Apollo, that is not our philosophy. We design solutions specifically for the problem at hand. We know the California apportionment is earned in 3 ways: in-person instruction, independent study work product completion, and home hospital hours of instruction. Each has their own way that attendance or instruction or work or instruction translates to apportionment. but every other SIS has put it all in attendance because attendance drives apportionment. Well, in Apollo, all 3 drive apportionment. So with that concept already in mind, I can simplify everything else. If I need to put a student on short-term independent study, even if they were marked absent today already, I can do this. I go to their enrollment record. I say add alternate instructional setting. I give it a type, long-term or short-term. If I choose short-term, the system is going to limit it to 15 days per LEA per year. So that's obviously state policy that has to be implemented. But we know your schools are accidentally putting kids in short-term independent study for more than 15 days. Same thing with the attendance recovery next year. It is limited to 15 days per year per LEA. So we give that short-term independent study. We can give them an enrollment reason, illness, vacation. We can do this ahead of time too. If mom calls in and says, hey, we're going to Hawaii in 2 weeks, I'd like to put my student on independent study, I can actually do this right now. I don't have to wait till then. I can put it in ahead of time and the system just does its thing. And that idea, by the way, of the system just doing its thing on that date that you put ahead of time, I haven't even mentioned it, is that with Apollo, there is no year-end rollover. There's no magic things you have to do. There's no rollover, there's no initializing attendance at the beginning of the year, there is no initializing grade reporting periods. They just magically begin. The data is already there, the dates are already in the system, and behind the scenes, we've already calculated everything necessary for that date to exist, to come about. So, again, going back to instructional settings and independent study, I can mark that vacation for the future, I can mark the illness in the past, whatever the case may be. I give the student a supervisor. Now that's going to be based upon, if it's elementary, it might be their primary teacher. If it's high school, whoever is assigned independent study supervisor roles. We give a start date, and of course it could be in the future, an end date, exit reason, and comment. But in others, yes?
Very technical question.
Yes.
This was entered for the future, and let's say Hawaii trip gets canceled. Will it at some point prompt like the user to like confirm that the student is out this day, or is it just going to be something that's missed and then all of a sudden the student is just logged?
So it's informed. This is kind of the next step on this one. Is that the system, when I go to attendance, if the student was on independent study, what I would see for Alan here is that on my attendance screen it says long-term independent study. So I can't take attendance on these days. Now if I'm a teacher and I see long-term independent study for Alan, and Alan's actually sitting in the chair right here, that's my confirmation that, okay, something's going on, I need to inform the district or the office. It would be kind of cool if you could push a button like, hey, the kid is actually here. And then it would maybe inform the office. That'd be kind of cool. But what we do is, first we lock them out of taking attendance. So you can't take attendance on independent study days because it's not attendance, right? It is work evaluation. So we have the screen work evaluation. This lists the teachers here. And so if I'm at the district office, I would see all of my independent study supervisors across the entire district. If I'm at a school, I'll just see those teachers. And only those supervisors or teachers that have independent study students that week that I'm looking at. So independent study is submitted 1 week at a time. Independent study work product completion is 1 week at a time. And so I'm going to show this. I can view students, but I'm just going to show it by teacher. And so I see Alan here. He was on independent study. And I have a single field here. I don't have to change one field at a time or one day at a time. It's not check boxes. It's not changing some sort of I to an L or whatever the case may be with your attendance reason codes in your current SIS. It is simply how many days during that week worth of work did the student complete, which they have to do anyway, right? This is what the supervisor literally does, right? Looks at the work, they did that much work, it counts that many days. Now we know the majority of your kids that I've seen in data, the majority of independent study students get 5 out of 5 days. They usually do a pretty good job. So we drop that in. This is sensitive to the days of the week, any school holidays. If the student didn't start until a Wednesday, it might show 1, 2, and 3 as options. So it's very smart. We have notes. We haven't finished this one up in terms of uploading sample work would be part of this at some point. I want to say I'm proud that a charter school, an independent study charter school, is just signed up with us, or has said they agree to sign a contract with us. And as part of that, we agreed to build out a massively deep independent study solution for them, so they can come off of school pathways, and so work product, bunch of grade book enhancements, tying assignments to instructional time, and really automating the independent study flow for independent study schools, obviously contract management being part of that. So that's we'll be working on that and come out this summer. But that's independent study in a nutshell. So I do this, I hit save. If I look at last week, I might have different students on independent study in the previous week. And so you can go back a couple of weeks and submit that data. So again, we're thinking outside the box. We are looking at things differently in new ways, applying real solutions that simplify the process. How, you ask the question, how often do your schools mess up independent study? How often do they mess up late versus tardy? How often do they mess up the discipline incidents? All of that goes away with Apollo.
Cam, can I ask you a question? It brings up a good point, and like what you're saying is, the answer is all the time. And so, let's say we're talking about CRDC, right? And we've gone from no or very few reports of some of those things you're talking about because of data entry error, those kinds of things, to all of a sudden now it's forcing you into doing these things. Have you guys thought about the repercussions of that, going from, let's say, 2 incidents in the entire district to 40 incidents because it's making you do it now? Because
you're under-reporting it. You've been under-reporting it, now you're over-reporting it.
Not intentionally, of course.
I know, no,
but
it's
like
a natural thing. And sometimes it goes the other way. With consistency, so not necessarily in terms of your precise question, the implications. What is the real implication downstream if all of a sudden you are reporting incidents now because the system is appropriately enforcing the policies to report them? There might also be the flip side. I have seen schools in one district, one unified school district, where this one particular principal was really nitpicky about the incident codes, the violations. And if one kid pinched another kid, it wasn't just a minor infraction. That principal would go straight to assault and put in that code. And so in looking at their CRDC just this year, and this one, so my wife was actually doing the CRDC submission for a school district, and she spotted it, and she's like, wow, okay, well, let's have a conversation with the district, because the numbers she was running, all of these violations were coming up. And they had to have a sit down talk with that principal, and are they going to change it? Are they going to not report it? That's going to be up to the district to kind of chase down and apply those. And there still remains, I think about how can I solve that problem and give better guidance for offenses, and not just have offense codes sitting there, but maybe can we go a little step further? Can we give some form of a survey to the principal to guide them through that decision-making process to have the right incidents or the incident offenses? So I'm already trying to think downstream. My focus is still on accuracy.
Yeah.
There is a problem also on the attendance front. I'll give you this one, is that in the apportionment side of things, student is absent 5 out of 6 periods. And I mentioned the automations in Apollo. In Apollo, there is no what we call the all-day code for attendance that you may be used to in other SISs. We actually auto-calculate that based upon the period absences. So your office staff doesn't have to do that. We handle it for you. And that all-day code is calculated in real time, so you won't have to wait for some manual process done a week or two later in order for that calculation to catch up. There's a big issue with some of the attendance calculations and dashboards in some of the legacy SISs. They're delayed by a couple of weeks because that all-day code is not auto-populated. So for us, it's on the fly. But the issue there is that 5 out of 6, according to California apportionment rules, you get apportionment because that one teacher didn't mark the student absent. So your ADA might go up in some conditions. But I've seen schools just go, you know what, if it's 5 out of 6, I'm gonna mark the whole day anyway. Because mom called in and said he was sick. So we mark it all day and we override the teacher side of things. So apportionment might go up, it might go down, but what we're trying to do is find the truth behind the reading. You have a question?
No, that was fine.
Okay. Oh, 5 minutes, that's what it was.
Yeah.
All right, perfect time. Well, good. You know, so I want to kind of, all right, I cannot leave without talking about CalPads, okay? Talked a lot about the data philosophies and policy, but the last thing is CalPads. And in CalPads, they haven't made things easy. CalPads has made things very hard for your staff. In order to submit a state ID request for just even one student, if you use the batch process, it takes you 5 steps. Now most SISs don't even lay it out in 5 steps, they make you run through some other convoluted process, but we lay it out in a nice workflow. What we did instead is we partnered with CalPads in a way that nobody else has in the past. And we developed a direct interface to CalPads so that you don't have to leave Apollo to work with CalPads. When you have a brand new student coming into your district today, and the student doesn't have will have their state ID, but more than likely if they're enrolling here in February, they probably came from another California district. And so we have right on our student screen the state identifier field. It's blank. And because it's blank, I have a search state ID button right here that if I click it, this will go to CalPads and it will in real time interact with the CalPads website on your behalf. It will do a student search on your behalf and it will return the results. So this all of a sudden moves from a centralized process that has to be done in batch. And you're thinking, gosh, I gotta get this kid tested on their LPAC. So I need an SENR record submitted to CalPads to own that student so that ETS and TOMS knows I could administer an LPAC. Or if it's a student who needs to take the CASP tomorrow, and how do you, everything's fast and it's like, well, in Apollo, once I get their SSID, I can actually submit that data to CalPads in real time and let's say they call it own the student, and own that student right now today in real time. I don't have to wait to upload a batch file to CalPads. If I exit a student, Apollo has the ability to send that exit information to CalPads in real time, directly. So that a CCE can be cleared immediately, CCE being a concurrent enrollment error. And that isn't necessarily the end of the world in terms of timing, but some schools and districts get really annoyed with CCEs and they bug your people, clear the CCE. It's like the kid exited last week, it's not a big deal. But we can clear those faster and more efficient. We also have a security issue with CalPads. I would call it a pretty significant security issue with CalPads that nobody is talking about. And that every time I go and need to send data to CalPads, no matter what SIS I'm using, I have to download that file to my hard drive. I have to then upload it to CalPads. And if I get a file back from CalPads, like a direct cert file, the list of kids who are direct cert qualified, I have to download it to my computer, to my laptop, to my hard drive. I have to then upload it to the SIS. So we have this data floating around on hard drives all over the place with massive amounts of PII that nobody talks about. Okay? Do you delete it? Sure, your CalPads administrator deletes every file in their downloads folder. I guarantee you, look at that downloads folder, you're gonna see dozens or hundreds of CalPads files sitting there. And it's not their fault, it's just a natural thing. I'm not gonna blame them. It's a system problem. In Apollo, we can solve that problem because we can side load files to CalPads and load files from CalPads on your behalf, and it never touches a local machine. It goes server to server, system to system. No other SIS has tried to do this with California. And to be honest, when I was at Aries, I didn't try to do it either. But you know who did it first? Parsec, right? They got in and started doing it. And so when I met with their team over a year ago, and they were talking about this thing that they were doing with CalPads, I'm like, really? You can do that? They let you get away with that? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, I'm in. So I did it with Apollo. So quite inspirational from the guys over here. And I think we have a great solution. But I think that kind of wraps us up on time.
Absolutely. Give it up for